G'day guys, and welcome to another Ausbridge Aero Life video. Today's video is going to be a bit of a self-repair video. We're going to install new rotors and disc pads for the front. So the first thing I do is take the cap off the brake fluid reservoir. Depending on how much is in there, I might take a little bit out. I do this because we're going to be pushing the pistons in, which is going to be forcing fluid back up the lines into the reservoir here. We don't want it overflowing. Make sure you've got some fluid though if you need to top it back up. A bit of a rule of thumb, guys, is you should always do both sides when you do things like rotors and brake pads and even bearings. So let's jack it up, get this wheel off, and let's get into it. Okay, so I've got the wheel off here. So what we're doing is we're replacing this rotor, the brake pads that sit inside the caliper here. So the reason I'm replacing this rotor is it's got a bit of warp in it. With the larger tyres, puts a bit of strain on the braking system as well as the drivetrain. So if you drive a little bit hard, you'll end up with a bit of warping and you'll get the vibration in your pedal. These days it's just as cheap to buy new rotors really, and if you're going to change the pads, and if you can do it yourself, it's probably more cost effective just to change the rotors out. The rotor is part of the hub assembly, so we have to pull it all out. The locking hub has to come off, and then we pull the caliper off, and then we pull the rotor and the hub out with all the bearings as well. So what I've done is I've just put a mark here and here. That way they'll go back on exactly the same way they come off. So now I've just got to take off these 10mm bolts here, take this hub cap off, and then I'll remove these 14mm bolts around here. So I've got the cap off the locking hub there with the 10mm bolts, so that just slid straight out. So nice and clean. Everything looks pretty hunky-dory in there. I can't see any metal or anything in there, so that's all good to go. So we'll just pull these 6 bolts out here, and as I said, there's a little clip in there. We'll pull that out. I'll show you how to get that out. You might have just a normal cover that just sits over the top of that. If you don't have the Ascend hubs, you'll have this assembly here, so that just sits over the spline, and then you have a little shim there as well, and then you have the dust cover that just sits over the top. So we've got all the bolts out of the hub there, so we're just going to slide that straight out like that. So I took the hub assembly off, guys, so I could show you the clip a little bit better. So this is just a little circlip here, okay, and it sits in a little groove here in the spline. So you need to take that in order to get that hub off. And all I do is use a set of these pliers here, which just spread that circlip open and pull it open, so you can move it over the top of the spline here. I just pop it in there like that. And if I can line it up properly, I just spread it, see that, and take it off. What you've left with now is you've left with the lock ring. You've got a couple of Phillips head screws in here just to lock the ring in place. So using a 17mm ring spanner, you've got 2 bolts to take the caliper off. You've got this one here, and then you've got this one down here. As well as those 17mm bolts, you've got one little bolt here, 10mm, just holding this plate onto the caliper, so you've got to get rid of that one as well. We take them out, and then we pull the caliper back, and we just mount it up over there somewhere and get it up out the way. Let's pull the caliper up out the way. I've just got a stretchy strap there. So once you've got those 2 screws out, that one and that one there, you can then just reach in and use something to get this little piece out of here. Probably a little pick or something would be better than what I'm doing, but nevertheless, there you go, I've got it out now. So I'll pull that off. You'll notice in here that there's a little keyway just here, and on this particular piece here you've got a little key, so that just sits over there. And so what that does is it locks the bearing nut, that ring there that acts as the nut that pulls all the bearings in. It stops it from coming out. Using a screwdriver or your fingers or whatever you like, you can just put something in here and just spin that around. So we've got the hub off, but what we're doing here essentially is just taking out these bolts. On the inner side here you can see a 14mm socket, just one on one side, and then I'm using the rattle gun on the other side to take them out. Once we get those bolts out there, these bolts here, 2, 4, 6 of them, then we can separate the hub from the rotor. So separating these things sometimes can be a bit of a pain. You might need to take to it with a rubber hammer from the other side. So I've got all these 6 out, but undoing the last one, I noticed that this was just going to slip off, so that's a bonus. So we can slip that off now, and we can put the new one in. So I've pulled the old rotor off. I've just got the hub assembly here. Just got a wire brush, and I'm just giving this a bit of a clean up around the edges here, make sure there's no foreign matter in there. Make sure it all seats nice and flat when we do the bolts up. Got a wipe out, just maybe you'll blow it out if you've got a compressor, and just be careful not to get dirt and dust in the bearing though. So I've got the new rotor sitting on there. I'm using the RDA Gen 3, the dimpled and slotted upgrade for this particular job today. So they're the RDA 236D. All good. So the new rotor's on. Throw a bit of grease in there. Just using the Penrite high temperature wheel bearing grease. Not too much, just whack a bit just to sort of give it a bit of a seal again, so when you put it back on the spline or the sub axle there, it'll push the grease through. So you're not actually greasing the bearing there, it's just creating a seal. Try not to get any grease or anything or your dirty hands over the rotor, or if you have, before you put it in, make sure you give it a good clean with some brake cleaner or something of the sort, just to get all that stuff off there. Yeah, so there she is. I've just slid her back on the axle there, and now I'll stick the front bearing back in. So I just repacked the front bearing and just threw that back in. But look, at this point I would say, you know, if you haven't done your bearings for a while, it's good preventative maintenance to actually change your bearings out at this point. While you've got it all apart, you'd be silly not to. If you thought that your bearings were a bit long in the tooth, when you're doing this sort of thing, consider redoing the bearings at the same time. So now we've got that little locking ring in there, so I've done that up to finger tight at the moment, so there'll be no torque on that. We should be setting the preload, do it up to about 130 foot-pound I think. Then you back it off to about 20 or about 30 if the bearing's a little bit worn in. I don't have the socket, guys. There's a socket you can get that has two little pins that locate in there that you can turn it around. But generally, like with all my bearings, I've really only, when it's setting the preload, I've really only just done it up as tight as I can and then just backed it off half a turn or so. Last time I did the bearings in this, I checked the bearings on them and redid them after I originally put them in, just to make sure that everything was still set up correctly. I never had any issues, but realistically you should have that little socket. You should be setting that preload properly and then backing it off. But as I say, I don't have those particular tools, so I'm going to just do it up as tight as I can do it. I usually just use a screwdriver and a hammer and just tap around as far as I can get. Don't tap in the hole that's got the thread in it, tap in the other hole, and then I'll just back it off a touch. Right, so I've got everything buttoned up in there. I've got that locking ring in there. I've done that up and then backed it off slightly, and then I've got this other particular ring here. And I've put the two screws back in, so you'll need to line that inner locking ring up with these two screws. You got plenty of holes there, so you know, just to get that back in, so you might have to fiddle around just a little bit. I usually like to pack a bit of grease in there just as well before I put the hub assembly back on, so just to keep it, it's more like just a seal, try and keep some of the water out, I guess. I mean, I'm not sure if it really does anything, but you know, doesn't hurt. So I've got this this hub assembly here all buttoned back up, and I've got inside there, I've got the lock ring placed back in, just using those pliers, and then just pushed it back in. Make sure it clips in properly. It's imperative that that's not going to come back out. So it should actually, when it's in there, it should be loose, so you should be able to feel it. You see how it's moving? Well, you might not be able to see it, but it's moving quite freely. That means it's sitting in the groove, because there's a little groove in the spline there. Okay, so make sure that's in properly. So if you've got the Asin hubs, it's at this point you probably want to make sure that, so whilst it's sitting in free, it should be right, because I lined the lines back up both here and here. So if I spin that now, I've got no movement in the CV, and if I just try and lock that in, so sorry about that, just lock it in. Now I get drive. You can see there I'm getting drive, so all good. So we're just trying to get that back around, so now we should be back to free again. Yeah, so all lined up and all back together, so now I can do these back up, replace the pads, put the rotor on, and this side's done. Right, so the rotor's all on and nice and smick. So I've pulled the old brake pads out. Went too bad actually, but I'm going to change them anyway because I'm doing the rotors. It's always good to new for new. So what I do is I just put a clamp in here, and I put the old brake pad in there, and I go over the top, do it up, and I just pull the pistons pull the pistons back in. That's to take the new brake pad, because obviously they're wider. So and that's the reason why we take some fluid out of the reservoir if it's full, or at least take the cap off. That's so it can float back through. And the pads I'm using are the Bendix, the DB1223. You don't have to bend them in apparently. We've got the brake pads in. They're a bit of a fiddly thing, but they're not too difficult, just fiddly. Rotor on, hub in, calipers on. It's really just time to put the tyre back on. So it's all done. Bit of an epic one, this one. I had a couple of things go wrong. So I had one bolt that stripped itself out on the passenger side hub. It took me probably an hour or so to get out, and on this side here I had an issue with the bearings. So just a couple of things to finish up. Don't forget to recheck your wheel bearings in a few hundred Ks. Don't forget to check your wheel nuts as well, to check your fluid reservoir, put your cap back on. Before you take off, pump your brakes up. Just take them for a spin down the road, give them a bit of pedal, see how you go, see how they're pulling up. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next video.